Well, I don't find it tedious, but interesting.
Click record. Okay, so we'll let people kind of make their way into our Zoom classroom. But I wanted to acknowledge that last week we left with many questions and a lot on our minds.
Jeremy, I don't mean to interrupt, but I made you host, and I want to make sure I now am not missing people trying to get in.
Yeah, it pops up on my thing, but what I will do, Marla, is I will make you a co-host.
Yeah,
so you'll see that stuff.
Great.
Okay, so you're a co-host. For those of you who have no idea what Marla and I are talking about, we're technologically somewhat competent. That's the message. Again, because there was this sort of like, okay, well, how is that supposed to help me with, all my friends or peers or the people I run into and the conversations that I have? I want to kind of like just, make space for some of that as early as possible. So again, for our agenda today, lingering stuff from last week, just to surface. I don't think we'll have a full discussion because I really do meant what I said in the email, that this question of in part 4B and in part 5B, where I say alignment today, no question, and then question, there, I would like to hope that the conversation we might have in each of those places is suggestive of solutions to some of what we were discussing last week. Not necessarily the solution, not necessarily a solution that works for you, but opening the doors to possibilities. Knowing, of course, that just to look at our syllabus, we're finishing, right? We're here, finishing pointer. We're finishing our unit on challenges to peoplehood, right? And next week is when we start looking at new models and figuring out what it means to be at home. So just to review the agenda again, we're going to open things up to sort of see if people had something to add to last week, or in thinking about it some more, you wanted to say something, add something, question something. Please, let's surface that. We're going to define our terms for this week: dual loyalty and identity politics. It turns out that we have to be very careful about those terms. So I'm going to take the time to do that. Then sources for each, and again, this issue of alignment for today, also for each. And when we get to the end of identity politics, when I say alignment today with a question mark, it's really because also of the dual loyalty question, right? Because identity politics today play off of some of the stuff we were talking about in terms of anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism on the right, on the left, and accusations of dual loyalty within our own community, let alone from the outside. Okay, so anyone still wanting to process in big ways or small ways some of last week before we delve into new material? You're okay. Okay, so here we go. Definitions. Oh, wait, Lori, go ahead.
I'm hoping that when we're done, we will have learned how to, not so much, once we recognize it, how do we handle discussions? Because people on both sides, left and right, want to minimize the impact of anti-Semitic statements. And I feel uncomfortable knowing how to really respond to that. Like, oh, it's only one person, or they didn't really mean that. And I think that that's not, and I just think that that's not really true that they do, but I don't know how to fend off that. So that was,
Yeah. So, and I'm going to give you a taste of our conclusion for today, because I'm hoping it helps with this specific question, which is I don't know that we can have a one size fits all approach, but I do think that by going through what we're going to go through tonight, you will have some more tools in your toolbox for understanding who it is you're talking to in that conversation, so that it's a more productive conversation. That does not solve our communal discourse in terms of like this Michael Che joke, or the episode on nurses where they said incorrect things about Jewish medical ethics, right? But it might help us with each other, and that's a place to start. I'm not saying we won't ever get to the communal stuff, but I do think that hopefully today we'll have a piece of something that maybe we can elevate to a communal level. Anybody else? All right, and thank you for that intention, Lori. I think it's good to know that, you know, learning is not just for its own sake. Sometimes we need it to be productive, and I share your desire to be able to do something with this. So here are some definitions for tonight. I attributed the first definition to myself because I wanted to give full credit to Michal Biton for the second one, but I will tell you that my dual loyalty definition draws heavily on the lecture by Danielle Hartman. By Yehuda Kurtzer at the opening of the first of the two units for this week. So the key here is that dual loyalty is an accusation. It is intentionally, right, meant to be derogatory, accusatory, right? And so that's why I call it an insidious denial of a human's multiple loyalties. We all have multiple loyalties. That's a normal, like, human thing to do. What we were studying all the way back at the very beginning about having a home, right, and telling stories. Those stories and that sense of being at home comes from being born into a family, living in a particular community. That can be a geographic community, an ethnic community, a racial community, a religious community. We belong to lots of different identities that require us to have a little bit of loyalty. Like, they kind of build that in us, and it would be natural for us to feel that. But when someone accuses us of dual loyalty as opposed to multiple loyalties, they are specifically saying that whatever it is that you and I share, or that they and I share, right? That one of my other loyalties is a contradiction to what I share with that other person. So again, for example, my loyalty to Israel and my loyalty to America, or my loyalty to the Jews and my loyalty to America, if another American accuses me of dual loyalty, they're really saying, I care more about the Jews or more about Israel than America, right? They're not saying I have multiple commitments. They're saying, I really care more about the other one, right? That they see as somehow a problem for being a good American. So our job tonight is to sort of understand how dual loyalty works, and how the Jewish community has dealt with it over time. Identity politics, okay, to again be careful about our language, is a political issue. It is not about our identities. It's not about how we go from one community to another or how we express our loyalties. It's what happens when we express our loyalties or our identities in policy, right? And by policy, that could be not necessarily an actual law. Sorry about this. Not necessarily an actual law, but it could be, do I participate in this march or in this protest or this letter writing campaign? Do I, try to get somebody elected to office? All of those questions, right, are part of identity politics. And what Michal Biton defines identity politics as, just so we're all on the same page, is a group-based political identity, again, political identity, most often rooted in one's racial, ethnic, sexual, religious, cultural, or gender identity. All those other identities that are human, right, ways of feeling at home or developing stories about ourselves that give us meaning and purpose in our lives, right? When we are part of a group that then has a political identity, then we're talking about identity politics. And crucial also for our conversation will be that it's an unapologetic affirmation of that particular aspect of one's heritage, right? So it's not just like, oh yeah, I'm from Delaware. It's like, no, this is the first state, and all you Pennsylvanians, you just pretend to be Delawareans, right? That's an unkind thing to say. It is nothing. It's not relevant. That's not identity politics, right? It's much more, right, about again making this a group thing that also has a political angle, and again, unapologetic affirmation. So yes, like the Delaware case was probably not the best, but being proud of whatever it is that your identity is, that makes a big difference. So, any questions on these definitions? All right, so let's look at sources on dual loyalty. I'm going to go through the first two a little bit quickly because you saw them last week and you saw them a few weeks before that. Pharaoh, as I mentioned last week, says, look at all these Israelites, they're numerous. Let's deal shrewdly with them, right? And the key point here is, where's my little pointer thing?
Jeremy, I don't know if it's only us, but we can't see the very left hand of the slide. Are we the only ones?
Change your view around.
I can see it.
Yeah, we
Right.
can see it too.
I can see it too. You know what?
We can see.
On my computer, I can actually like lower the font, instead of saying 100%, bring it down to 80%, and that may help.
Also, if you go to view, Marla, there's side by side speaker view or
We got
gallery.
it. We got it. We got
You got
it.
it. You got it. Okay, good. So, because I want you to see, here's my little pointer. Okay, so,
You want everybody to mute again, right?
yes, please. Thank you. Okay. So right here, the key though is that Pharaoh is worried that in the event of war, the Israelites, the Jews, right, might join the enemies of Pharaoh. And I think I told this group last week that this makes a lot of sense. This is a real thing. The Jews, like with Joseph and like that whole thing, probably was part of the Hyksos group of pharaohs. They were slightly different than the southern, more like top of the Nile. The Nile actually flows from south to north, so it's a little confusing. But when you think of like Thebes and that sort of thing, like our typical image of a pharaoh is of these later pharaohs who would have been worried about the Jews aligning with a different Egyptian power group known as the Hyksos. So this, it's a real, again, dual loyalty accusation. Haman, not only was he offended, and since today is officially, well, not anymore because the sun went down, but it's Shushan Purim. So in Jerusalem, they celebrate Purim a day after everybody else because it was a walled city from the time of Esther. And but you don't do that on Shabbat. So they celebrated today. So again, Haman was not just upset that Mordechai wouldn't kneel or bow low, as we have in the verse 5 here, right? It's also that he saw that the Jews were spread throughout the Persian Empire, which had wide geographic boundaries. And instead of, being good Persians, it looked to Haman, or it was easy enough for Haman to accuse the Jews, right, of being so insular that we kept our own laws and we were not like the Persians of what became Iran or Iraq. We were not like the Egyptian Persians. We were not like the Palestinian Persians. We weren't really allowed to live there. And so we were just enough different, right, that it was not in King Ahasuerus's interest to tolerate us. So that was the accusation. Now we get into some really interesting stuff, because just to be clear, in between Ahasuerus and Napoleon is like a lot of history, like 2,000 years of history. So let me just give you a kind of overview of what life was like for the Jews. Essentially, everywhere we went, we lived under somebody else's rule. It didn't matter whether we were in North Africa or Spain under Muslim rulers, right? We were second-class citizens in those societies. We always had to kind of walk a fine line with the caliph or the local ruler. Same thing throughout Europe. And before Islam and Christian Europe, there were the Romans and the Greeks, like Antiochus IV, that Hanukkah story is all about, right? We always lived kind of in this sort of like, even when we had our own like opportunities for self-governance, it was always at the behest of whatever the other ruler around was letting us have. So once the Roman Empire kind of turns into a Christian empire under Constantine, we are kind of always at the behest of a local lord, king, duke, baron, whatever it is, right? And if things are going well, then we're welcome. If things are not going well, but they need our money, we're welcome. If things are going poorly, we get kicked out and we're supposed to like leave all of our wealth behind. And so we end up moving all around Europe during much of the time period between, in particular, let's say 1100 and 1750, just for argument's sake, okay? Moving all around. Generally speaking, going from west to east, although, again, 1492 in the Spanish Inquisition was its own thing, where Jews of Spain went to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, but also to Brazil, and to Amsterdam. And most of the Jews of Europe, whether it was France or England or parts of the Holy Roman Empire, which became sort of Prussia, we ended up in kind of Poland and Czechoslovakia, and then finally into Belarusia and the Ukraine, right? Slowly but surely over a period of all that time until Napoleon. And there are two things happening at the same time when it comes to Napoleon. One is that we're beginning the Enlightenment. So there's this question of, how does society treat its members? And then you have the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And whatever you think of Napoleon, one of the interesting things that he did that is generally seen as a good thing, at least for the Jews, is he took the French Revolution's call for liberté, égalité, fraternité, right, for equality and liberty and brotherhood, right? He took that and he expanded it to the Jews who had never been given that opportunity before. Never been equal, full citizens in any country other than like under King David and his descendants since, right, the time of, you basically have to go back to 586 BCE, because even when we come back from Babylonian exile under Cyrus the Great, it's with permission from Cyrus the Great. Okay, so for 2,500 years, Jews always lived, again, at the behest of somebody else until Napoleon says, you know, I want to extend the mission of the French Revolution to all of the French people. I don't know what to do about you Jews, though. So he asks a group of Jewish notables that he calls the Sanhedrin, going back to ancient rabbinic literature. The Sanhedrin hadn't functioned since maybe the year 200, maybe a little bit later, maybe as late as 300, okay? And again, not necessarily with real power. And this is the sort of set of questions that he asks. So a few key phrases are in here. He sends commissioners to have this conversation, and here in the highlight, the wish of His Majesty is that you should be Frenchmen. Awesome, that's pretty exciting. Although I would think that the Jews at that time thought of themselves as Frenchmen, so we're gonna have to tease this out. It remains with you to accept the proffered title without forgetting that. To prove unworthy of it would be renouncing it altogether. So, you know, if we don't take Napoleon's offer, he's going to kill us, or kick us out. So it's not exactly like a friendly offer, but it's out there. So to kind of soften that, it's our most ardent wish to be able to report to the emperor that individuals of the Jewish persuasion, of the Jewish persuasion. That's interesting phrasing here, Jewish persuasion. Okay, can reckon as many faithful subjects determined to conform, right, in everything to the laws and to the morality which ought to regulate the conduct of all Frenchmen. Judaism, we are being asked to turn into a persuasion as opposed to a kind of ethnic identity. And we're asked to conform to laws and morality. So the laws piece, that's easy. The morality piece is a little more interesting, right? To conduct ourselves like all Frenchmen. There's a series of questions that will help establish this. So not for nothing, France, even though it was free and full of liberty, is still Catholic. So divorce is not really a Catholic thing. So can Jews divorce? And if divorce is valid, you know, is it whose laws, right? The laws of the state or Jewish laws? And while we're talking about marriage, can a Jewish woman marry a Christian man, or a Jew marry a Christian woman? Right? How insular are you going to be, you Jews? Let me test your boundaries. And then this key question: in the eyes of the Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brethren or strangers? So you might remember last week, we had a passage from Leviticus that started our different circles of loyalty with our brethren, then our kinspeople, like, you know, members of our people, and then like an extended sort of group of people. And then acknowledging that there were neighbors, the l'orecha, ve'ahavta l'orecha kamocha. We're going to love our neighbor as ourselves. So people who are not part of our people, but we live with them. And then there are foreigners, the stranger who comes to live with us. So are Frenchmen going to be our neighbors, like our brethren, or, you know, even actually our brethren, like all the way in the middle circle? Or are they going to be strangers? What's the boundary? And because this is the dual loyalty question, are Jews born in France and treated by law as French citizens going to consider France their country, bound to defend it, bound to obey the laws and follow the directions of the civil code? One way of testing that is, are we going to have our own police, our own justice system, anything that we can't do by profession? And then, by the way, Napoleon's a very smart man. He notices that Jews in this time period don't charge interest to each other, right? So he wants to know, you know, this whole thing about being like fully French, you're not going to charge other Frenchmen, especially not the state, interest, are you? I'm telling you, this guy, he knows what's going on, right? Because, right, does Jewish law forbid, or does it allow usury towards strangers? So brethren versus strangers. That's the key point here, brethren and strangers. How do the Jews reply? So they're going to answer all the questions. And I don't bring you all of the answers because frankly, I don't remember that the Hartman curriculum includes all of it, but like I brought you key pieces. The first thing they do is not just to express their gratitude and love and blah, blah, blah for Napoleon, right? They do so in the name of all Frenchmen professing the religion of Moses. This is the first move in sort of modern history or proto-modern history, where we say outwardly, we're going to be French, but inwardly, we're going to be Jewish. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to be Jewish like on the street, but it does mean that we're going to start to think of Judaism as a religion, as a private matter, right? Distinctly from how we use our other identities, particularly when it comes to politics. Okay, so this is the beginning of Judaism being, right, and all religions, frankly, Catholicism too, being sort of an internal issue. And so that's the language that the Jewish notables of this era use. And basically what they say is we want to be good citizens and we're going to obey the law. So, but let's get to the hard questions like this one. In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as their brethren or are they considered as strangers? And the answer is, in the eyes of Jews, Frenchmen are their brethren and not strangers. There are achim, they're not just like, no, they're not Am Yisrael, they're not part of Bnei Yisrael, but our French compatriots are brethren. They're not people who are even our neighbors. They're definitely not strangers. They are going to be a part of a close circle with us. To prove the point, and to kind of make it so that Judaism and being French work together beautifully, what do they say? They say that the Jewish religion, so that's what they mean here by a religion, whose fundamental maxims are such, a religion which makes it a duty to love the stranger, right? So even if you were a stranger, we'd have to love you, but we're going to call you brethren. This is that whole fraternity, like, right? Like the French revolutionary concept of being fraternal, again, compatriots. So our actual religion says that it enforces the practice of social virtues that must surely require that its followers should consider their fellow citizens as brethren, right? So, it's telling us to love. Judaism says love the stranger. So your fellow citizens, they have to be brethren. Like it has to be at a higher level. And how could we do anything otherwise, right? We live in the same land. We're protected by the same government, the same laws. We have the same rights and the same duties. All right. So they conclude this little piece by saying, yes, France is, sorry, I'm having trouble with my like little directions thing here. So Marla, you couldn't see what you were doing before, but now I can't see it. I have to make it go away. Here. France is our country. All Frenchmen are our brethren. This glorious title, meaning citizenship, by raising us in our own esteem becomes a sure pledge that we will never cease to be worthy of it. We're going to be the best French citizens ever. Going back to all those other questions, are we going to consider France our country, defend it, be bound by the laws? And the answer is, by the way, this is the answer, right? We've lived here for many generations. We adopted France as our homeland, right? Rashi was French. There are great rabbis in Provence, like from the 12 and 1300s, and they were, we've been French for a long time, so we want to keep this, and it's our sacred and honorable and bounden duty to defend the country. And it's not just like because we're French; it's also because we're Jewish. Jeremiah, the passage we studied many times over, tells us or told us when we went to Babylon, right, that we should till the ground, build houses, sow and plant. And if you add to that, this is another one of those cute things where, like, you know, if Napoleon can say, I don't want you to charge me interest, the Jews can say, we hear what you're saying. So watch what they do. The Jewish notables say, Ezra, and it's there in the text. I didn't show it to you prior, but Cyrus the Great of Persia, after he takes over for the Babylonians, allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. How many went? 49,000. Not so many. And the number was mostly poor people. Don't worry, Napoleon. Anyone who's going to leave here, there's just going to be the poor people. All the wealthy Jews are going to stay, which is like, you know, music to Napoleon's ears because that's more money. So they play that usury question very well. But it's in our text. It's part of our tradition. It's true. It's happened in history that most Jews actually stayed in Babylonia, right? And that's how we ended up with the Babylonian Talmud in contrast to the Jerusalem Talmud. And then to just kind of bring this to a close, a French Jew considers himself in England as among strangers, although he may be among Jews. To prove the point, I want to make it clear that, right, England and France, we don't get along, right? Napoleon hasn't met his Waterloo yet in 1806. So if you want to see what this is all about, the Jews are going to make it super clear to you, Napoleon. If we went and had Shabbat dinner in London, we would not feel at home because we would not be with French people. Yeah, it's Shabbat, it's Jewish, but like, they're not our Jews. They're like those English Jews, right? And by the way, if English Jews came here and had Shabbat in Paris, they'd be like, what is this cheese? Like, I don't understand, like, you know, and not feel at home among the Jews of France, right? And then it just concludes with this bit about during the last war, French Jews were seen fighting desperately against other Jews, right? We're going to choose our country over our Jewish, you know, peoplehood, and we're covered with honorable wounds in the field of honor, noble rewards, and bravery, right? You don't get Alfred Dreyfus without Jews being in the army. Questions about Napoleon's questions or the response? Yes, Jill.
I don't understand how he got around the usury.
I'm not saying that the Jews didn't charge him interest. I'm saying he wanted them not to, right? So
But how did he explain that they were or weren't? Since it's brethren versus strangers, and of course the French are our brethren, and we're only going to charge it to the strangers, but we're still going to charge it to you anyway.
Yeah, so the reality is that Jews actually did charge each other interest. It's like, you know, sort of not the prettiest part of our history, but it's a reality. So like Jewish bankers, right, made loans. And yes, maybe someone who was in dire straits could get a Hebrew free loan, right, like the Hebrew Free Loan Society. But by and large, the real practice in banking, Jewish banking throughout Europe was actually to charge ourselves interest. So my sense is that they just negotiated with Napoleon a good rate. You know, the same way anybody else with power can probably get a better rate than your average Joe walking in to, you know, one of these sort of very large multinational banks today.
Jeremy,
yes.
the fact is that the rabbis found a way around charging interest. It's a very complicated subject.
Yes.
I've read about, but I still don't recall all the details. But the Jews did, in fact, charge each other interest. Right. They didn't call it interest.
And that's just it. And it's and like, you know, not for nothing. I just want to be clear. Like, you see this also with Muslim banking, right? The same rule applies. They're not supposed to charge interest to each other, but like you need a loan, and the bank still needs to kind of like hedge its bets and whatever else. So there are ways to construct, right, a monetary exchange that works by law, like by halakha or by sharia, and these situations exist. But again, like as Fred is saying, right, Jews did charge each other some form of interest, just not whatever usury was really supposed to translate into. Other questions on what the Jews? Yes, Jerry.
So how much of this was color and cover, and how much of this did the average Jew in France really believe?
So really, I don't know. I want to be honest. Like, I was not in France in 1806. The key thing here seems to be that enough members of the Jewish community, and particularly the ones who traveled in society where citizenship meant something, in practical terms. I'm not sure that your farmer, your poor farmer, cared whether he was a citizen or not, right? But someone who was traveling in society, either middle class or upper class, it would matter to them. They liked this a lot because it allowed, again, this sort of sense that for the first time, it was not a conflict to be a Jew and a French person. Now, again, like I mentioned Dreyfus, 90 years later, it turns out not to be so safe or to be so fair. But it appears that this was great for the Jews. And I want to make one more thing clear too, which is Napoleon didn't just do this for France. Napoleon literally opened every ghetto in Europe that existed at the time that he marched across. So the Italians had Jews in ghettos, like in Venice, right? It was not a Nazi thing to have a ghetto. It was first an Italian thing, and then it kind of spread from there. And some Jews liked it, like it was protective, it was, like it worked. But Napoleon said, enough, throw the gates open, right? What it means to be a member of the world today, particularly in his empire, is to have freedom and local citizenship, right? Now, not every country gave Jews in their countries citizenship, but that was the idea. Andrew, is that did I get your name right?
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, my family is French, and my dad's been doing a lot of genealogy, and it's really interesting to talk about Napoleon because our family has always venerated Napoleon, even though he's kind of seen as a villain throughout the rest of the world. We loved him,
and this is why. Absolutely, this is why. Right, and what's interesting here is so what's going on with the dual loyalty question is Napoleon wants to see if we're going to have a dual loyalty, and the answer is no, right? Jews play this game throughout Europe, right? From 1806 through to the Dreyfus Affair, right? Which is what gets the World Zionist Congress really abuzz, right? So there are some places in Europe where it wasn't so great. And I don't mean all the way Eastern Europe, I mean kind of Central Europe. And the very fact that Theodor Herzl is a journalist from Austria, from Vienna, in Paris, in time to report on the Dreyfus Affair, which for those of you who don't know, there's a Jewish captain in the army who's framed, right? And the accusation is that he's more loyal to his Jewish whatever. It's a very anti-Semitic thing. The French left defend him, and this still makes that sort of whole thing about how comfortable should we really be as citizens of these great societies. Now that Jews are going to all kinds of European universities, is it safe for us? And it turns out, that's 1896, I think. So within 40 years, the answer is clearly not, right? But in those intervening years, it was very much a question.
Jeremy?
Yes.
I think one of the things that perhaps Napoleon didn't understand was that there were different attitudes amongst the Jews. He's talking to the French Jews.
Right.
Asked the Mitnagdim of this, they would never have agreed.
Absolutely, and for what it's worth, the Mitnagdim Jews are mostly based like in Vilna and Lithuania, right? And there are other Jews who, as a result of Napoleon, I want to be clear about this, as a result of Napoleon opening those ghettos and saying Jews should be part of society, right? Some Jews, right, the Reform movement took off in this moment, right? We made entree into the rest of civil society. We wanted our synagogues to look like churches because we wanted to be just like our German compatriots in Berlin and in other cities. Or, right, we're in the Ukraine and the Baal Shem Tov is telling us, like, forget emancipation and freedom, forget the Mitnagdim who are like very precise about the law. Let's get back to just spirituality and like your own feelings and emotion and joy in Judaism, right? Like all of this happens in the wake of, right, Napoleon's kind of playing with what it means to be a citizen in the world and the notion of citizenship in general. So let's see what happens shortly after. I thought I went too far. Yeah, okay, so Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis ends up saying something more radical than the Jews of France in response to Napoleon, right? And again, like 100 years later. He says that, first of all, no American should imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism, right? Zionism and Americanism, totally compatible. And then he reminds us what I said at the outset, multiple loyalties, right, are objectionable only when they're inconsistent, meaning we all have them. And he goes on to say, right, you're a better citizen of the United States if you're loyal, right, to your state, your city, your family, your profession, your trade. And then, you know, because he's arrived in the world, loyal to your college, right, your alma mater, or your lodge, right, the Knights of Columbus and the Rotary Club, like, right? You are trained to be a good citizen of the United States by being involved in loyalties that teach you how to be involved politically. If you're not on the school board, or you're not, you know, paying attention to the town council or the city council, the county government, right? How are you going to vote in a national election? This is Brandeis's argument, right? And again, in the beginning of the 20th century, it's a pretty good argument. To make the point, you know, Irish Americans who contributed towards advancing home rule, meaning for Ireland, they're better men and a better American for the sacrifice that they made. For every American Jew who aids in advancing Jewish settlement in Palestine, even though he or his descendants will never live there, is likewise better as a person and as American for doing so, right? Expressing loyalty teaches you to be a good patriot. And if you can't do it for one part of your life, you're not going to be able to do it for the part that, quote, counts, which is being American. And not only that, what America is all about is this kind of brotherhood of man. Here we have, again, that fraternity kind of thing, right? America's fundamental law seeks to make real the brotherhood of man. That brotherhood became the fundamental law of Judaism, right? More than 2,500 years ago. Jews have been doing this for forever. You got it from us. And he adds, this is interesting. So, because this goes back to last week a little bit with the right and the left. In addition to this sort of nationalism kind of thing that he's like picking up on, right? He also says that Jews have been striving for social justice. It's demanded for in our text and tradition, just like in the 20th century, right? And he's the one who's like taking care of all the antitrust suits and working for workers' rights. And you know, after the Triangle Fire, like he is fully involved in seeing that the moment that he lives in is a moment of American social justice that also, right, is part of our prophetic tradition. And we've been practicing this. We've been practicing democracy and persecution for all this time. it makes us passionate for righteousness. And then this is the radical thing he's going to say. You ready? Indeed, loyalty to America demands rather that each American Jew be a Zionist. Just let that sink in for a minute, because other texts that we studied, right? The Reform movement's response to the World Zionist Congress and eventually to Ben Gurion, right, is we're happy here. We don't need Israel. And just for what it's worth, there are background source readings that have an exchange between Ben Gurion and the head of the CCAR, which is the head of the Reform Rabbinate, as to whether or not Jews should send money or actually make aliyah. And both of them equivocate, meaning like, yes, by all means, we should support the state, right? But we don't need to move there, comes through. Brandeis is saying, being a Zionist makes us better Americans. I want you to keep this in mind. There's more, but I'm going to come back to it. So like, I know I didn't finish the text. Okay. So I'm just asking, Americanness and Zionism, could it align in this model if we use Brandeis a little bit?
No, there was no Jewish state at the time that Brandeis spoke. It was the words were easy to say.
Okay, right. So it's one thing in theory, it's another thing in practice.
Yes.
Any other reactions about this idea that, like, being a Zionist makes you a good American?
Well, I just want to say it's easy as long as the goals and circumstances align.
Okay.
Like, before there was a state, we didn't really have any conflict. And to be honest with you, up until pretty recently, it was like, yeah, you could be all in both lock, stock, and barrel. That's changing, which is why I think it's changing in that our interests may not always align perfectly.
I'm going to push back a little bit in a minute, but other reactions? Andrew, it looked like you might want to say something.
Yeah, isn't Zionism, also kind of, well, at least for Israel, closely related to socialism?
Yeah, so one form of Zionism was socialist. At this point, this is again the sort of theory and practice. The socialist governments that kind of had control of Israel and was the leading party for the first, I don't know, let's say 40 years of the country, has given way to Likud, which is Netanyahu's party, which is a little bit, not a little bit more, it's a lot more capitalist, and and so the dynamic has shifted, right? Other thoughts before I push back on yes, Jerry.
I don't think this has become a big issue up until the last 4 or 5 years, because Israel was always a bipartisan issue. And I think one of the big things that's happened, unfortunately, and I think as a result of this last administration, is that Israel and Zionism has become a partisan issue in our political system. That's very dangerous. I can't recall this concept of dual loyalty being an issue. I've been around for a while, up until the last 4 or 5 years.
Jerry.
So the way this is presented to me sometimes is what I call the unstoppable force meeting an immovable object teku, problem, where they say yes, maybe 80%, maybe 90%, maybe even 95%, the interests of Israel and the United States overlap. But what will happen where are your loyalties when you come to a place where their interests are diametrically opposed? What will you do then?
Yes. Right. And so this is how I want to push back a little bit, which is that I would like to suggest that the Brandeis model works on the right and on the left. That on the right, where sometimes people on the left will get accused of dual loyalty, the evangelical community wants the embassy in Jerusalem and It happened in the last administration. It was promised by Clinton. It was promised by George W. Bush. It was promised by Obama, right? So a lot of Americans who aren't Jewish think that a strong Israel is good for America. And so to align yourself as a Zionist in that regard is to be a good American in that piece of American society or political life. I'm not saying it's everything, right? So I acknowledge the lack of bipartisanship, but it's right. It's less about bipartisan and more about there being a divide, which is to say, I think the right thinks that you can be a good Zionist, or being a good Zionist makes you a good American. I think also on the left, this is in a way true, and it's just not talked about enough because there's a lot of discoloration and dealing with accusations from the other side, which is to say, the fact that Israel is the most LGBTQ friendly country in the Middle East, or that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, or that that one can kind of protest freely against the government or whatever else, those pieces and pursuit of a two-state solution or some kind of care for the Palestinians, again, understanding that the Palestinians have their own authority that's supposed to be kind of administering their government affairs, makes things work on the left in terms of some, but not all, social justice issues, right? And again, that's not to say that, and we're going to talk about BDS in a little bit, right? That's not to say that there aren't people on the left who think that, right, Zionism isn't problematic, but there is a version of holding Israel to moral account that is a piece of, right, being a good Zionist and being a good American because we care about certain kinds of values. And that values conversation, right, is an alignment of loyalty. Again, hard to hold conversation with the other side, but not necessarily, right, being accused of dual loyalty within your lane. Okay, and again, you can disagree. So let's look at identity politics to see if it's worse than I said, or if it actually kind of can play out, because I'm not convinced either. It's an idea. So as we were just saying, right, like given that other people are going to point fingers at us and accuse us of dual loyalty, we should be the last to be calling out each other. And we need to kind of create an ethical communal discourse. We haven't yet, just to be clear. And hopefully this course will help us a little bit. And we need to be aware that, by the way, when the right accuses the left or the left accuses the right of dual loyalty, right, of being sort of more caring about Israel than about America or American values, or right, caring more about certain kinds of values than caring about like the larger American agenda in the Middle East, right? Who wins? The white supremacists. So we have to be careful, right? And not just the white supremacists, also, right, the sort of anti-Semites within BDS, right? Mahmoud Barghouti, right? He gains. And when we become complicit with the rhetoric, we undermine our collective capacity to resist when the arguments are used against us. And by extension, we should be careful about doing this also with other groups, right? So just when we get into the whole racial politics or anything of the other sort of like issues of our day, we also need to be careful about, you know, who we're accusing of what. The last two slides are from Hartman, not necessarily for me, but like I think they are really important reminders of why this matters. I'm going to skip this. It's interesting. You'll have the slides soon. He's basically saying what we've been saying, which is that Zionism, when it's about loyalty, is a problem. But when it's about everything else, like philanthropy, tourism, culture, religion, spiritual connection, activism, then we can have some real conversation. So like we should think differently about what Zionism is. Let's do some identity politics, okay? And Michal Biton in her lecture does something really interesting. So I'm going to walk you through pieces of it, but where she ends is again one of these sort of potential solutions. So if I go a little bit fast in the interest of time, because I want to have some discussion, again, you can go back through the text when I send you the slides tomorrow. She says that in much the same way that Brandeis said that Zionism and Americanism are sort of not just parallel, but like mutually reinforcing. She says that Jews, when it comes to identity politics, have played whatever the current game has been, right? So in Brandeis's era, and for a long time after, equal rights for all is good for the Jews. That's the language we spoke. Kind of like the French Jews responding to Napoleon. Well, whatever you need, we're going to do it, right? We're going to be as French as any other Frenchman. We're going to be more French than them, right? And so we're going to, as Jews, pursue equal rights for everybody because that's American and it happens to benefit us, right? We're going to say the quiet part out loud. What ends up happening, though, is at a certain time in American history, identity politics becomes the new way of doing things. We go from a melting pot to the tossed salad of multiculturalism, right? So instead of everyone's like flavors mixing with everybody else, and like there's a whole new American stew, like, you know, we need just the right amount of zest from the crispy lettuce to the tomatoes to, you know, I don't know if you like corn and beans in your salad, but whatever it is, right? Tuna, yeah, right? We want each of our identities, right, to help to kind of bring out extra flavor and nutrition in the salad of America and its multiculturalism. And so identity politics becomes more important. And then the current version of that is even more complicated. So here we go. Emma Lazarus was very into her Judaism. You might know her for writing this poem that is engraved on the Statue of Liberty, right? And without question, she easily could have written a poem about the Jews. But because of the time and the place, she wrote it about everybody. So it says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send Lees, the Jews. Oh no, I'm sorry. The homeless, tempest tossed to me. She was thinking and this is one of those things that's going to come out later, as a Sephardic Jew, as a Jew who endured, like, and again, in the sort of like, in the genetic kind of incorporation of trauma of the Inquisition, right? That the world is not safe for Jews. And she is in a position of privilege. She's going to exercise that on behalf of Jews, but she's going to do it in a way that's good for everybody. She knows there are Jews from Eastern Europe who are going to be coming, right? But she also knows there are Irish folk who are you know, surviving the potato. She is writing for everybody because that's the American thing to do. And she says, the Statue of Liberty lifts my lamp beside the golden door. Fast forward to the March on Washington. Something like 4 speakers before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Rabbi Joachim Prince, also Sephardic, speaks. And he calls on his experience of actually being in Germany. So kind of like an Ashkenazi story, but right, he himself, again, having this sort of different heritage. And he says, when I was rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. He's going to surprise you with what he learned. The most important thing that I learned under those circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. It's not about Hitler and the Nazis picking on Jews. it's about everybody else being quiet. That's what he learned in Berlin. And skipping ahead, America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all of America. I must speak up and act from the president, America must speak up and act from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. You know, we're so taken with like MLK, which because his speech was really good, right? But the Jews who were present at the March on Washington and spoke, what was being said on our behalf is that America's values are good for all of us and we should advance them, not just because it's good for the Negro, not just because we're here, right, marching for civil rights for Black people who were enslaved in prior generations. It's because of American ideals. So this is again that continuity of like using American ideals, right, to express that what's good for the Jews is being like good at equal rights for all. Okay, but things shift because who's the like other person contemporaneous to MLK? Like it's Martin and Malcolm, right? Malcolm X is like, we can't keep playing the white game, right? They're gonna keep telling us everything is gonna be okay, but no, it's not enough. And in the wake of Black Power and the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, something interesting really happens. And we might not actually appreciate that this occurred. So Mark Dollinger wrote this book, Black Power and Jewish Politics. It was a bit of a scandal like 6 months ago because there's a new afterword or foreword, and there was a whole thing with the publisher not wanting to allow Mark Dollinger to say certain things about Black Lives Matter. So I'm just saying, it's the fact that I have this quote here and it was from before all of that scandal is just interesting that it was included. But what he captures in this one little paragraph is fascinating. He said that like Donald Feldstein was doing some research and found that with college-age Jews, right, as of 1970, it's no longer embarrassing or out to belong to a group on campus with the word Jew in the title. Before that, yes, there was Hillel, right? And there were Jewish fraternities and sororities. I don't know exactly when they came to be, right? But you were quietly Jewish or embarrassed about your Judaism, or, you were doing the Jewish thing because it was parallel to what the WASPs were doing on campus, but that changed in the 60s. By 1970, there's a Jewish this, a Jewish that, right? A newspaper, like club after club after club with Jew in the title or Jewish. Literally scores of Jewish groups forming on college campuses across the country with aggressively Jewish missions that imitated the style, spirit, and tactics of the New Left and Black Power and Black militants. So college campuses change over this time period, and being Jewish is seen as something that you should be in and of itself, right? Because being more firmly at home in your Jewish identity makes you a better contributor to college campus or to the conversation on campus. If only it were still true today, right? Also at this time, I don't have a text for it, but it's worth saying that when Israel successfully defended itself in 1968 and then again in 1973 in the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, pride among Jews and understanding that Jewish power was okay, right? As self-defense, mind you, but like that, it had a place in the world. Also encouraged Jews to be more active in the political sphere all across the country, and in particular gave a lot of the sort of like I don't know how to put it exactly, the sort of like the power that kind of fed into the Soviet Jewry movement this picture is not from the Soviet Jewry rally in Washington, D.C., only because it happens to like have so much else going on in it with the Let My People Go and the big crowd. And I thought that there are Torah scrolls in the picture. I'm having trouble seeing them, and you might be having trouble too. But there should be right here, I think. Yes, this gentleman is holding a Torah scroll. Sorry, my pointer wasn't active. Go back here. Pointer right here is a Torah scroll. So like very Jewish presence at the Soviet Jewry rally, right? And what are we doing? We're saying that the Soviet Union should let Jews go, but we're not just saying it like, you know, for the sake of saying it out loud. We're saying it so that Ronald Reagan pushes Gorbachev to let Jews out of Russia so that they can go to Israel or the United States. We didn't do anything like that. It was a lot of like very careful backroom conversations with Roosevelt and with Truman, right? Like this is a whole new different kind of Jewish expression and very real, and it's successful. Before I do the next question so far, am I making sense?
You put your head above the water, you're going to get a wave on you pretty quickly.
I was
Yes.
gonna say we got full of ourselves, didn't we?
Kind of. And I want to say something else, which is that like, okay, if you're using this whole wave imagery, we weren't paying attention to the undertow either. So the next text is about the undertow. Because at the same time we were doing this, very appropriately in terms of psychology, in terms of everything else, we were teaching the Holocaust like nobody's business.
Jeremy, when you referred to the Jewish fraternity, the growth of Jewish fraternities, the Jewish fraternities because Jews were not admitted to regular fraternities, just like hospitals where Jewish doctors couldn't get jobs.
Correct.
You know,
so a lot of that changes in 68 is when a lot of the sort of like, you know, university and medical, like all of that stuff changes. And I know that the sororities and fraternities existed before, right? But what I guess I was trying to say is that it became much more in the late 60s and early 70s, the kind of thing where you would be proud to be in those fraternities, and you might be more likely to, you know, wear your letters on campus in a way that might not have been true a decade before. I don't have evidence for that, but that's the sort of
Well, I can give you evidence for that because I started college in 1971. So,
and
it's very accurate. Both the activist portion being, although the picture you showed was from a little later.
Yes.
Was there, and certainly when I started in college, the Jewish organization was called the Jewish Student Council, and everyone was very proud to use the term Jewish.
Yep. So again, not that the institutions didn't exist before. Same thing, AIPAC existed in 1950 something, right? Because of the challenges of lobbying FDR, right? But what AIPAC ends up doing in the 80s is wildly different than what it had done, you know, prior to the 70s, and it's this shift in how we think about our power. So the other piece is that, like, look, you know, and in some ways I didn't need to bring this, but I wanted to for a lot of reasons. The undertow is that, so what is the narrative? The narrative is we could have power and we should exert our power, but also, right, why? Because we don't want to give Hitler a posthumous victory. And so at the same time as all of that's going on, we also find, particularly in the 80s, an obsession with the Holocaust. So much so that, like, it's down here. I have to kind of, right now, what seems to be the priority is building Holocaust memorials, right? Billions of dollars have been pledged or spent, right? 2 to 3 million. That's an enormous amount of money going to build Holocaust memorials and research centers and libraries. Like Los Angeles has 2 or 3 that compete. And the US Holocaust Museum in DC, right? $168 million. That's money that was going to a particular educational vision of what Judaism should be in America, right? Which is a kind of like never again, not just on behalf of Jews, but on all minorities, avoiding genocide. But the after effect, and this is really important as we get to the identity politics of today, is that it's quite likely that a young Jew today knows who Hitler and Eichmann were, but has no idea of Rabbi Akiva and Maimonides. I see a lot of nodding heads, knowing, and I just want you to tell you, like, I overlap with some of this. Like, I went on the March to the Living and was taken from Auschwitz to Birkenau on Yom HaShoah, and then I went to Israel. And by the way, part of that narrative is that the Jews of Europe were weak and the Jews of Israel are strong. And it feeds into, right, this story that makes it a little bit harder to do both the social justice lens and the sort of national patriotism, Zionism lens at the same time, right? Because you have to have power, but the power has to come from knowing your tradition and not just knowing what you don't want to be, which is to be a victim. And he goes on to say in this opinion piece, right? It's no wonder young Jews are turned off and walking away from Judaism.
Jeremy, do you agree with his statement that was highlighted in the blue, that it was there by obsessing over the Holocaust is exacting a great price? It's killing American Jews. Why? Just because of the money spent on the monuments?
Not just the money. I mean, the money is sort of a red herring. It's actually that instead of teaching a rich tradition, instead of doing what we're doing right now, Gen Xers and millennials who came after were not taught Jewish text.
How does he know that?
How does he know that?
Right.
He doesn't exactly know that yet, but he is seeing this. Well, actually, he could know it. I take it back. He could see it. And again, I don't know what's in the ellipses, right? I didn't like go back to the original article to read the whole thing, but this right here, more than a quarter of the books published on Jewish themes today concerned the Holocaust. And he says at the beginning, this is appropriate. This is like important like thing for us to do, right? There's a great justification for continuing what he calls an obsession with the Holocaust, right? Because the wound is still raw. And survivors, right? Also, by 1992, we were starting to worry we would forget all of their stories. In 1990 is when Steven Spielberg launches the Holocaust project, like where he records videos of every survivor he can get on tape, right? And I see your hand, so just give me a moment. Lizzie, I'll call on you in a moment. So the thing is, like, as a youth at that time, if I wanted to know what being Jewish was about, it was about not letting the Holocaust happen again. It was about Israel in certain ways, right? And but it was not about Jeremiah or Esther or the rabbis of the Talmud. Literally, I never knew what the rabbis of the Talmud were until I got to college. And even then it was in my sophomore year. And I was like a very involved Jew, right? Lizzie, I want to take your comment before, did I lose you?
Yeah, I'm here.
There.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to speak on this because this is absolutely my experience. I was born in 1992. So just so, you know, like I grew up in that time of that. And that's, I swear that's all we ever learned about. I learned about the Holocaust, I feel like all day, every day in Hebrew school. I learned to read Hebrew phonetically and I learned about the Holocaust. And that's it. And when I was in 7th grade, I mean, I'm sure, you know, when I was in 7th grade, we learned about Anne Frank. And so in like regular, not, you know, regular school, we had to do projects on the Holocaust and I just did mine by memory. And my teacher was like, how do you know all this stuff? And I'm like, because I go to Hebrew school. Like I was teaching her things that she'd never seen and never knew about. And I felt so inundated with Holocaust everything, Holocaust imagery. I used to have nightmares because I learned so much about it, like when I was a kid. And I remember, like, when I was on Birthright, we still, I mean, you know, it's a really incredible experience to go to the Holocaust Museum in Israel. But I had a conversation there that I was like, but why am I still only hearing about the Holocaust? Like, at that point I was on Birthright in Israel, and I was like, I don't even know what's going on in Israel. You know, I was like 18 years old, but I was like, what is politics in Israel? What's going on? Like, I didn't know anything about, you know, Hamas or Palestine. I didn't know anything about anything because that's all I was ever taught.
Thank you for sharing. And I'll just sort of like, again, echo that, like.
Or that's all you ever absorbed.
No, I mean, it's literally all we were presented with, Seth. Like.
I disagree. I think that we absorb what is maybe easy to absorb or sexy or horrible, but, it's unfair. And I think it's insulting to our Jewish educators to say that all we ever talked about was the Holocaust.
Okay, well, I mean, sure. Like, I'm sure we learned about some holidays when holidays happen. Like, I don't literally mean the only words that ever happened in my Hebrew school were, but that is the experience and the takeaways that I got from my Jewish education. And I don't want it to be that way for future generations. So that's what I took away.
Lori.
I grew up much older, and I didn't know very much about the Holocaust because it actually, when I went to school, early 60s, they did not talk about it in Hebrew school. And it's very much more traditional Hebrew school learning and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I went to a summer camp where they had pictures of the Holocaust on the walls, like in 1965 or later. And so I think that, from my perspective, I didn't know of very much. And then they must have turned on the spigot of teaching it. And it's just another comment. It's very interesting in doing the book club for Congregation Beth Shalom. It's often a comment, and I get this from my son's wife. We don't want to read Holocaust books. We've had enough of Holocaust. And I've always found that no two books about the Holocaust were ever alike, and there's something. But anyhow, I just thought I would share that there is a lot of pushback on that even now.
So, Lori, you raised two important points. One is a kind of historical thing, which is that after the Eichmann trial, literally for the first time in like world Jewish history, people felt comfortable talking about the Shoah. Most survivors would not have shared their stories until he was convicted, and until stories of survivors were part of the court case against him and were played in public on the radio in Israel and televised. And so there was an awakening of the story itself, and then the need to tell the story. So I guess what I want to do with the second part of what your comment raises for me is to say that where I want us to go in the next 9 minutes, God help us, is that if we can appreciate, right, that we grew up in different decades or have different experiences from wherever our families came from and our family histories, which is to say, by the way, right, children of survivors and survivors themselves, right, would read this text very differently. And I think that's why it's important to recognize that he starts off by saying that there is great justification for this obsession, right? But it's not necessarily a bad thing for those of us who grew up in the 80s or the 90s to understand that it might have felt like it was an obsession to the exclusion of other things. And what were those other things, particularly if we didn't go to day school, which, by the way, also in the 80s and 90s was a relatively new-ish thing. Day schools kind of took off in the sort of progressive Jewish community in the 70s as in a response to desegregation, frankly. Okay, and it's not until the 90s when, in particular, there's the Jewish study, the population study in 1990 that comes out and says that intermarriage is a big problem. And so then this idea that we have to invest in Jewish educational experiences like camp and day school, because those have lasting ways of helping us stay married to other Jews, that was the dialogue. I'm not saying like good or bad, but that was the dialogue, carried through. And so, each of these pieces has its sort of like its wake. So it's that there's the wave, there's the undertow, but then there's also the after effect. So let me jump forward. This is an interesting piece about like how Jews fit into the whole equation from James Baldwin. I encourage you to read it. But what I want to do today is look at Michal Biton's why she did not join the Women's March in 2016 or 2017, right? So the day after Trump's inauguration, there was the big march. And for those of you who were in my Shabbat sermon, not this week, but last week, right? This is it, okay? So she says a few different things. I want to just make sure we get them in, right? She says, okay, unlike the first, this is 2019, sorry. This is the new Women's March. So unlike the first march in 2017, many Jewish women have pledged not to attend this year because the march's leaders are tied to anti-Semitic head of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, and other reports of anti-Jewish sentiment. So like, look, she's saying some Jews are going to be there and some are not. And she says like, what did I do here? Okay. She says, Jewish women of color marching, JWOC marching, right, is circulating on Facebook and Twitter because there are going to be Jews who are marching and they're Jews of color. And Yavila McCoy, who's a Black Jewish woman who's a very strong Jewish leader, right, she's on the steering committee and she's urging representation of Jews in the march because the voices and experiences of Jewish women of color need to be part of that particular contingency. And she said, Biton says, the campaign released a nuanced, thoughtful statement which clearly outlines why many women of color are committed to the Women's March as part of an intersectional struggle of solidarity against oppression. So again, there are very good reasons, particularly as, and I'm just going to be very clear here, African-American Jewish women participating in the march, right? And also some other Jews of color, but like in particular, African-American Jewish women, okay? But she says she can't do it. And she ends up saying a lot about why, partly because how she grew up. She is a Latina from Argentina and also of Sephardic descent, okay? And it's a 2-pager, so give me a second to move on here. I don't know what I just opened accidentally. Her identity, my identity, which otherwise fits in with intersectional fight for common liberation and for women's rights, informs her refusal to participate in a movement led by individuals who have contributed to the normalization of anti-Semitic discourse and who have yet, despite recent apologies, to regain the trust of many in the Jewish community in this issue, myself included. So for her, it's because of her identity. It's because of having family members and friends who were killed in the bombing of the AMIA building in Argentina, and the stories of Jews in Arab lands who are her ancestors and her Sephardic heritage going back to the Inquisition, that she feels anti-Semitism differently than Yavila McCoy and other Jewish women of color. And so she is going to exclude herself from this particular march. And so she says all of this, right, to challenge the dichotomy that has already begun to emerge, a dichotomy that posits an either-or worldview in which individuals who refuse to march in this particular women's movement are portrayed as not caring for social or racial justice. She does care, but something else in her identity outweighs that particular care, right? And it's the part that experienced anti-Semitism. So again, for survivors, for children of survivors, for people whose family were strongly affected by the Holocaust, right? really important that we do a lot about Holocaust education. And frankly, like, I am glad that the recent bill passed in the Delaware legislature, making sure that we learn about the Holocaust in schools, right? But if the only version of Judaism that shows up in our public school system is the Holocaust, what are we saying? And particularly if it's the Holocaust and Israel, and probably Israel as an oppressor, right? Not saying that that's a fair presentation, but that's likely to be what shows up in a curriculum. So Marla, I see your hand. I want to put out there that Michal Biton is kind of suggesting that a solution might be to understand that all of us are more complicated. And Lori, I said I would try to give you this like potential way of dealing with people, which is, like, I need to understand about any of you or anybody else I run into in synagogue or at the market, or at God willing, someday we'll go back to coffee shops and actually see each other there, right? And I need to know just enough about their history and their family, their loyalties that feed their perspective on what it means to be Jewish and to be American, in order to say, oh, I get where you're coming from. And I'm going to rely on this text more than that text. But if we can kind of move from you being deviant because your background kind of pushes you into what I consider a certain kind of category, maybe we can actually sit at the table. And I might not like what you have to say, but I can tolerate it differently because I too have a complex history. And maybe, right, we can even go back to Brandeis. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Maybe we can go back to Brandeis and do this one last piece, which is that that we might do deeds worthy of our ancestors, that we might act upon the social justice and the patriotism of Zionism, and be involved, right? Because if we just keep it inside, it gets that much more confusing. So Marla, you had your hand up, and I know I just opened a lot of cans of worms. So.
Well, no, you were just talking about the Women's March, but it's exactly what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes, it is.
And I have some of my very best friends it became uncomfortable for me because, of course, parts of it I supported, but the title Black Lives Matters movement was problematic, and just being in this vice of not wanting to appear to not be supportive of what we know is racial injustice. On the other hand, what we believe it stands for. So it's much more current than the Women's March, which was kind of just the start of this most current vice we've been put in.
Right, and what I would ask us to do in terms of like when we look outside of our community and accuse people of dual loyalties, not everyone who has a Black Lives Matter sign or sticker or participates in a march supports the organization,
right?
Black Lives Matter or
I
matters,
distinguish between,
right? And
right.
You have to, right? So, and this is really hard for all of us, right? To distinguish between institutional organizations that take stands that we find hateful, right? Versus the people who are engaged in some of the work on the ground. And whether we partner with them, whether we support them, whether we stand back because it's too hard for us, like, should all be legitimate choices that help us to navigate, again, pluralism, tolerance, deviance, and is it tolerable or intolerable deviance? Josh Sachs.
Well, my thoughts on some of this, like, I'm very left-wing in my politics, like DSA level almost, which is problematic if you're a strong Zionist as well. But my feeling is it's better to have a seat at the table, because we can't just if you believe with somebody politically, but they have some blank spot or like something that they don't know everything there is to know about Israel. They buy into some concept, or I think a lot of it has to do with a kind of feeling on the left that the loser is always the good guy. I mean, just something fairly simple like that. Like,
Yeah.
Good guys never win. So in other words, always take the side of the downtrodden, no matter how they may have gotten there, and who's to blame. I mean, it's very simplistic I think people get mixed up between blame, which I think Israel is like fifth down on the list of who's to blame for the Palestinians' plight, but they may very well be number one on the list among who could do something about it.
Right.
So to me, that's a big conflict there. Israel is the entity that could do the most to help Palestinians, even though the Palestinians themselves, their leadership, the rest of the Arab world, the rest of the world, who basically was very happy to let them suffer. I mean,
and
Jordan, Syria,
Right.
all mistreat Palestinians horribly in smaller numbers. They just let enough in to basically enslave them for all intents and purposes. So, but it's a very complex issue, and a lot of people aren't ready for complex. They just want easy answers to stuff, and the easy answer is the Palestinians are in terrible shape. Israel, the country of the Jews, has control over where they live. Ergo, Israel's to blame. Let's not complicate things.
Yeah. So
I think it's our place. Just finish. So I think it's my place and others to don't let that stand. If we just walk away and say we're not going to be part of Black Lives Matter or a march or something, just say leave it to the anti-Semites or to. I think the number of people in those groups who are actually anti-Semites is small, but I think there are a lot of people who are just content not to think it all through and are influenced by anti-Semites.
It's a good point that we're going to kind of try to bear out in particular over the next 2 weeks. So Jerry, just before I call on you, I think it's worth noting that in much the same way, Josh, that you talk about the left, wanting to make sure that we're fighting for the underdog. The right has done a very good job of identifying why different people might care about different issues and differentiating and taking that complexity and making it a different kind of simple. So for example, the way in which the Trump campaign dealt with Latin Americans in Florida, right, pushing socialism as anathema, was very understanding of the complexity of the Hispanic vote, right, in Florida, in ways that the left has not yet quite understood. And I don't, it's not a criticism or anything in particular so much as what I'm inviting all of us to do is to recognize that complexity, right, left, right. The key thing here that I'm hoping we get to in the next 2 weeks is that Josh's idea of being in dialogue with all these different people is going to be part of the way forward. That there are going to be Jews who are associating with far left, or people on the left who aren't so far left but are associated with anti-Semitic, different leaders, and the same thing on the right, right? And the question is, how are we going to operate as a community, right, that encompasses that wide variety? So Jerry, Simonis.
Thank you. I want to comment on two things. One was about Holocaust education.
Yes.
And I'm the child of a survivor, just so I'm very open about that. And I think to some extent what I heard from my parents and other survivors was their biggest fear was that the Holocaust would be forgotten. And as the Holocaust faded more and more chronologically into the past, they had a very strong desire to almost increase by that same amount the amount of focus on the education around the Holocaust to make sure that it was not forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that's a lot of how we got to where it was too much. It was overload. And I agree that it was. The second thing I wanted to comment on is earlier I mentioned my problem of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. And the last reading that you did about the woman who refused to march really was an example of that.
Yes.
And her answer to that situation is, I have a moral red line that I will not cross. And that will guide me as to what decision I make. And that's what I was hearing in that a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And this is what I want us to appreciate is that, in all the ways that we are complex, in all the ways that identity politics has allowed us to investigate and to get to know that which makes our particular stories even more particular, right, is the ways in which we need to learn to listen to each other, right, and to find new kinds of commonality. And the reason I brought that Holocaust education piece is really like, because it used to be that pretty much every Jew, whether you went to Hebrew school in a synagogue or a day school or a yeshiva, you kind of knew the same material. And that is so not true anymore. And so we have to find new ways of creating that way in which, right, a Jew might arrive on campus and feel proud to be Jewish in a way that isn't going to make them also like the subject of all kinds of different issues on campus, because college is, you know, a dynamic place, particularly today. I'm conscious of the time and the way in which that, like, as Josh said last week, like maybe we need just a whole session of just like talking it all out. So like that's still on the table. I want to share one last thing before I kind of like just see if there are any other questions or comments, and we sign off for the night, which is that
liberty. Fascinating stuff, Jeremy.
Yes, right. It's like incredible. So the Unit 11 interview is after Michal Biton like describes basically the history that I did with Emma's Lazarus and all those texts. But she interviews Alana Stein-Hain and Rabbi Rachel Timmener. And Alana Stein-Hain is a modern Orthodox woman who has a PhD. Anyone else would call her a rabbi. She served as paraclergy in Lincoln Square Synagogue. But the two of them have this dialogue about how Rachel Timmener is a female. She's a feminist. She's a lesbian. So LGBTQ issues are really big for her. A Jew, and she wants to be involved and have a seat at the table, like Josh was saying, right? And Alana Stein-Hain is saying, like, my Judaism comes first. I come from a worldview in which, right, my feminism is colored by my Judaism, and the balance between the two. It's a very nice dialogue. The key component of which is they can have that dialogue because, right, they speak enough of a common language. And that, I think, is our goal. The other, inclusion here is that Danielle Hartman, Alana Stein-Hain, and Yossi Klein Halevi. Remember last week I said Klein Halevi feels like, the only anti-Semitism to really worry about is lethal Jew hatred. They discuss the SNL joke that happened last week right before our class. And so if you want to like hear them engage in that conversation about like why we shouldn't make a big deal out of it, but we still need to acknowledge it, the link to the podcast will be here as well. The last thing I want to kind of put out there is, sorry to be kind of making you, is really the question of like, if the goal of alignment of our Jewish identity and our American identity is to see the enactment of our values, in what ways is America's division good for us and creates more opportunity, or perhaps too divided, such that like it's going to be hard to have a kind of unified Jewish community. I've been teasing where I think we're going to go with all of this, but our next two classes are really trying to get away from what makes this all hard to like, what are we going to do about it? And I'm very much looking forward to that conversation. So any other questions you're afraid of losing? And Marla, go first.
Because we have many on this call that are part of leadership in our community. Are we going to learn like some practical things, or is it theoretical in terms of what we can do about it?
You won't learn practical things. We will raise some opportunities that could be put into practice.
Great.
Right. But Hartman is a think tank,
Right.
and if there is a practice, it's having conversations like we're having. Right.
So everyone on this for the next 2 weeks, be listening, because it's really, I feel, our responsibility to try and make a difference when it comes to this material in our community.
Yeah, Gary Herod.
Yeah, Jeremy, do you think America was ever aligned? I mean, 2 Jews, 10 opinions.
Right. So the interesting question is, in some ways, which America, right? So in the same way that the issues around racial equity are coming to the fore in new language, right? We are kind of facing that same question. You know, were we always talking about the America when Brandeis spoke and when Rabbi Prince spoke at the March on Washington, or were we only looking at a piece of America? And the Ku Klux Klan is actually a really big piece of America. And what do we do with that? And as America has kind of entered into this period of media division, right? So that we have our own echo chambers, you know, how much of the population is really far right or far left, and how much is different versions of the center? And as Jill Lepore said in like one of our prior texts, like we have to recover a narrative of Americanism, right? That speaks for the center, that speaks for as a kind of like moral progress and an attempt to achieve the aspirations of America's founding fathers in ways that are going to take time and be really hard, and are probably harder than we thought when, you know, we bought into being a part of a particular kind of America. And then, just speaking as a little bit of a sociologist, that America was the Protestant Catholic Jew when it was okay, you know, to be of a certain kind of religious life. That like there's the vision of America in the 50s, like we were all the same, and the reality is we weren't, right? And now we are reckoning with some of that. I personally have faith we'll come out the other side, particularly if we, right, can engage in American texts in the same way we're engaging with Jewish texts.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, everybody. Have a great night. Recordings and final thoughts, like enduring understandings to come. And I'm looking forward to next week when we look at, you know, potential models for getting along.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Have a good night.
Absolutely.
Good evening.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.